Hello, everyone. This is a topic that I've been wanting to do for a very long time. And given the circumstances that we're going through right now in the world with the crisis, I think I'll buckle down and do it. The question is really basic. What generation Beatle fan are you? And I want to tell you how I've come to my conclusion after, I think, getting it wrong originally and then switching it around in subsequent years. Okay? For me, I was born in 1962. So when the Beatles came to America and when they played the Ed Sullivan Show, I wasn't even 2 years old yet. Okay, I was one and change, you know. So in that regard, I did not get to experience the Beatles. And although I really liked the Beatles when I was a child, I didn't really get to be fully into my Beatlemania until I would say in the mid 70s, around 75, 76 is when I really got heavily into collecting the Beatles and being like a fanatic and the way I collect now. So I was pretty happy for most of my life to consider myself a second generation Beatle fan because I grew up in the 1970s, Beatles were the 60s. I grew up in the 70s. I became a collector in the 70s. So therefore, I am a second generation Beatle fan. And I have no problem with that. I have no problem thinking like that. I have no problem accepting myself like that. And that's what I did well into I would say into my 20s perhaps. Excuse me, let me fix this mic a little. Into my 20s or thereabouts. And one day something happened that made me think differently about it. There's a person who's a Beatles fan that I know. Maybe you've heard of him. I'll just mention his name, Steve Morer. Steve Morer is somebody that I met when I was 18, actually, and he was born in 1955, so he was 9 when the Beatles came to America or thereabouts, 10, getting to be 10 years old. So he has more of a upbringing at the first wave of Beatlemania. But when I talked to Steve, what he said to me was, "What do you mean you're a second generation Beatle fan? You're not a second generation Beatle fan." I said, "Well, then what am I?" He said, "You're a first generation Beatle fan." I said, "How do you figure that?" He said, "Did you have the records when you were a child and listen to them?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Did you like the Beatles when they were here in the 60s and they were doing it in the early days?" I said, "Well, yeah, sure, I did. I knew who they were. I liked them." He said, "Well, then you're a first generation fan." And ever since then, I thought, the guy's right. And let me tell you a little bit about what I started considering in order to feel that way about it. And let me say, I have no problems with me being a second generation fan. This is not as if I'm trying really hard to fight myself and try to make myself an original fan. I'm not. I just realized that I am because I was aware of the Beatles. Now, although I didn't see the Ed Sullivan Show, or maybe I did see it, maybe my parents were watching it, and I was only a year and change, so I didn't recognize it or think about it or even acknowledge it. But I distinctly remember we were living in an apartment at the time, and I got to tell you, folks, I have a fantastic memory for things that happened 50 or more years ago. The problem I have is with my short-term memory. As a lot of people getting older can attest to. My short-term memory is the problem, not the long-term memory. So, therefore, I have really vivid, clear memories of having some Beatles 45s and albums. I remember I had aunts and uncles that would buy me some of the albums. I remember having Meet the Beatles very clearly. I remember having the 45 with the picture sleeve for Nowhere Man. I remember having the Day Tripper We Can Work It Out single. I have very, very clear memories of those days, and I remember loving the Beatles. Now, my mother tells me, and it's in my baby book, a lot of us have baby books with baby pictures and writings in there. It says favorite songs, and she mentioned them. She said, She Loves You, Yeah, Yeah, Yeah. My mother wrote in the book. She wrote Help, or any Beatles song. I used to go crazy over. And she said, You love the Beatles at 3. At 3 years old. That would be 1965. the Help era. And I have a memory of going to see Help in the theater. My memory, my mother doesn't even remember it, but my memory is that for whatever reason we left the theater early before the movie was over. Maybe my mother didn't like it, I don't know. And I remember kind of crying and causing a ruckus and not wanting to leave the theater and looking at the poster as we're leaving the theater and she's taking me by the hand for whatever reason. But I remember that. Now I also recall very clearly the Beatles cartoon show. The Beatles cartoon show was on 1966 and 1967. That would make me 4 and 5. Still can see the apartment. Still can see the lighting in the apartment. You know, the sun coming through. I could see the TV set in my mind, and I could see the cartoons on there. And follow the bouncing ball. Well, it wasn't follow the bouncing ball. It was the words of the songs. I think you're getting my shows mixed up, but you'd see the words, and that's how I got to really learn a lot of the Beatles songs. I remember very clearly the introduction that had the and Your Bird Can Sing song that I thought was such a cool introduction. To this day, I love that intro. And I remember the girls chasing them in the cartoons. They were crazy about the Beatles and getting mauled by the Beatle fans, stuff like that. I remember all this as clear as a bell. I was a fan, and I want to talk about Carole and Murray, who I refer to. Carole and Murray. These were two young women. I don't know how old they were at the time. When you're 5, 6, 7 years old, something like that, a lot of times they all seem like they're adults. They're a lot older than you. I don't know how old they were at the time. Whether they were 18, 19, 20, 21. I don't know how old they were. They were my mother's cousins. I always call them my Aunt Carol and Aunt Marie, but really, they're my mother's first cousins. So, like I said, my cousins, my girl cousins, and we would frequently go over to their house, and they were Beatle fans. And I remember going up into the room. They showed me inside the room, the bedroom, and they had the Beatles Remco dolls, the little dolls of the four Beatles. I remember seeing the Beatles tour book, showing me the pictures in the tour book, and I could still see the pages in my mind of what I was looking at. But most importantly, in the basement is where they had a record player, and they would take a record player and they would have the 45s lined up, boxes and boxes of 45s. Uh, Marie and Carol were big fans. They even went to Shea Stadium, and every time you would talk to them about it, they would say what everybody says. We went to Shea Stadium, couldn't hear a thing over the screams. They didn't hear anything. But I remember going to their home a lot, and I would always excited to go there for the Beatles. And they would take the albums out and kind of take the album covers, the U.S. Capitol albums, and spread them over a table. They had a big seemed like a huge at the time dinner table, dining room table or something down there in the basement. It was kind of like a basement apartment, it was fancy. And I would look at all the covers and pick out which ones I liked and put them in order and stuff like that. And then they'd let me go over. Very brave women, because I wouldn't let any little kid play with my turntable. But they would let me go over to the phonograph, the record player, old-fashioned 60s record player, and they would pull out a chair, because I was just a little kid, and I'd have to stand on top of the chair to get to the phonograph, and I would play whatever records I wanted. I remember playing a Hard Day's Night, the United States Hard Day's Night, with the black UA label, with the dots, colored dots spinning around, listening to a Hard Day's Night, and I should have known better. I just loved the Beatles, and this is why I consider myself a first generation fan. I loved the records, I loved the songs, I was aware of the Beatles, and was a fanatic over them during the 60s when they were here. Okay. Um, as time went on, I would forget about the Beatles and I wouldn't rediscover them until I was about 13, 14 in 75, 76. But we'll talk about that in another video, because I have another idea at some point of something that I would like to do later on. But that's the gist of how I feel about this, folks. It was definitely a Beatlemania for me, for this little kid. Now I have some pictures that I want to show you. Not many pictures really survive, but I have a couple of pictures. The first picture is me and my mom, and in this first picture you're going to see my mother holding me, and she's wearing a Ringo Starr mask for Halloween. I wish I had the Halloween mask now, but I don't anymore. So I mean, there it is. I think she also wrote that on my first Halloween, I went as Ringo of the Beatles. Quote is what she wrote. So there you go. Uh, and then another picture that I have, I talked about the days when I would go to Carole and Marie's house, look forward to it, and play Beatle records. And they took one picture of me, and my hair is down in a mop top. Also, I don't know if that's my way my hair naturally looked, or if they styled it that way. But here's the photo of that. And so there you go. You can see that I really loved the Beatles in the 60s while they were doing it. So I consider myself a first generation fan. What generation fan are you and why? Thanks everybody for watching.